before the first emperor raised his armies, before the walls of the forbidden city touched the sky, before the Shang carved their messages into bone and bronze. There was a kingdom spoken only in whispers, a civilization that lived in the gray space between history and myth. Its name was Xia. To the Chinese, it was the beginning, the first age of kings, the first proof that humanity could rule under heaven's order. To historians, it is a mystery that has haunted generations, a dynasty praised in legend, yet invisible in the soil. For 3,000 years, the Xia has remained hidden, a name without ruins, a kingdom without a tomb, a story that may have shaped all of Chinese civilization even if it never truly existed. In the beginning, there was water, endless, merciless, unstoppable water. Ancient chronicles describe a deluge so vast that mountains became islands and valleys turned into seas. It is called the Great Flood. Whether myth or memory, it left its mark on every story of China's creation. Villages disappeared beneath the waves. Tribes fled to higher ground. Generations passed, and still the floods did not cease. The gods were silent, and the people despaired. But among them rose a man, not a god, not a king, but a worker. His name was Yu. He studied the waters, followed the rivers, learned the language of the earth. Where his father had failed by building dams, Yu dug channels, carving paths for the flood to escape. He and his men worked day and night for 13 years, never once returning home. When the waters finally receded, the world had changed. Yu became the hero who restored balance between heaven and earth. The people bowed to him. And for the first time, one man ruled all the tribes under a single order. He became known as Yu the Great, the founder of the Xia. For centuries, that story was told as the moment when China began. But how much of it was true? The earliest texts that mention the Xia were written 1,000 years after its supposed existence. They describe 20 kings, a capital named Yangcheng, and a dynasty that lasted nearly 500 years. Yet not one artifact bears their names. Archaeologists searched for cities, for tombs, for inscriptions, but the earth remained silent. To some scholars, this silence is the final verdict. To others, it is the greatest challenge in the history of Chinese archaeology. In the early 20th century, as China struggled through revolution and reform, a group of archaeologists set out to uncover its deepest roots. They believed that the Xia was not a legend only forgotten. In 1928, at a site called Erlitou in Henan province, they began to dig. What they found was extraordinary. Beneath layers of soil lay the remains of a vast city avenues aligned to the cardinal points. Palatial foundations, bronze workshops, turquoise inlays, jade ornaments, and carefully planned drainage systems. This was not the chaos of tribes. It was civilization. The radiocarbon dates placed Erlitou between 1,900 and 1,500 BCE, older than any known Chinese kingdom. Could this be the long-lost capital of the Xia? For decades, the debate raged. The government called Erlitou the site of the Xia capital. Enfresqued, museums labeled its artifacts as Xia bronzes, but many historians refused to accept it. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, impressive, but not conclusive. No inscriptions, no royal names, no explicit mention of Yu or his descendants. The truth remained buried between layers of fact and faith. So what do we really know about this shadow dynasty? According to ancient texts, Yu's descendants ruled for 14 generations. They built cities along the Yellow River, developed early bronze technology, and created the foundations of ritual kingship. The belief that the ruler's virtue maintained harmony between heaven and earth. When a king became corrupt, heaven withdrew its favor, sending disasters as warnings. If he ignored them, rebellion would follow. This concept would later be known as the mandate of heaven, and it became the moral spine of every Chinese dynasty to come. The Zhou, who rose centuries later, used this idea to justify their conquest of the Shang. They said the Shang had lost heaven's favor just as the Xia once had. To make that story work, The Xia had to exist even if only as myth. That is why the Xia remains both sacred and suspect. A dynasty too perfect to disprove, too convenient to ignore. In 1978, Chinese archaeologists returned to Erlitou armed with new technology. They uncovered wide ceremonial avenues and palatial complexes arranged in perfect symmetry. They found bronze vessels shaped like dragons, symbols of authority that predated the Shang. They even discovered early signs of social hierarchy: rich tombs for nobles, simpler graves for commoners. The pattern fit the description of a centralized state. Erlitou looked like a capital. Still, one question echoed through every excavation site. Where were the kings? Where were their names, their inscriptions, their voices? History without words is a house without doors. And the Xia, for all its grandeur, had left none. Some historians began to look beyond artifacts. They turned to climate records, sediment layers, and genetic traces. Around 2000 BCE, a massive flood did occur along the Yellow River, one of the largest in prehistory. Sediment dating matched almost exactly the timeline of Yu's flood in the texts. The event was real. If the flood was real, could the man who tamed it also have been real? Perhaps Yu was not one person, but many. A collective memory of engineers and leaders who unified scattered tribes in the aftermath of disaster. Their deeds were fused into one story, one name, one dynasty. Over time, myth compressed centuries into a single legend. The Xia, then, would not be a fiction, but a reflection history distilled into symbol. Every civilization needs a beginning, a story of origin that tells its people who they are. The Greeks had their titans, the Sumerians had their flood kings, the Egyptians had Osiris and the first pharaohs, and China had Yu, the Great, and the Shai. In that sense, whether or not the Xia truly existed matters less than what it meant. It meant order emerging from chaos, virtue triumphing over corruption, heaven choosing man, and man honoring heaven. It gave a moral blueprint that survived for millennia. Without the Xia, the idea of heaven's mandate might never have been born. Without the mandate, the Zhou could not claim their throne. Without Zhou's philosophy, Confucius might never have spoken of harmony and virtue. Without Confucius, the very soul of China would be different. A myth built the foundations of an empire. The story continues with tragedy. As the chronicles tell it, the later kings of Xia grew arrogant and cruel. The last ruler, King Ji, was said to have built lakes of wine and forced men to drown in them. He ordered towers of jade, while his people starved. In his court danced a woman named Moxie, whose laughter drowned the cries of the dying. When the people could bear no more, heaven's mandate passed to a new tribe, the Shang. They rose in rebellion, defeated Ji, and began a new dynasty. To the Zhou historians who wrote centuries later, this fall was proof of heaven's justice. To modern scholars, it was a parable, a political warning disguised as history. Power, it says, must serve virtue, or virtue will destroy power. That lesson, born in the myth of Xia, became China's oldest law. Even in our age of satellites and DNA sequencing, the Xia remains elusive. Every few years, new discoveries reopen the debate. A new site appears, a new inscription, a new theory that claims to prove once and for all that the Xia was real. But the answers always dissolve into the mist of uncertainty. Maybe that's the point. The Xia endures because it refuses to be captured. It stands on the border between truth and belief, a place where archaeology meets philosophy. When you hold a bronze vessel from Erlitou in your hands, you are touching something older than written Chinese, older than recorded history, older than memory itself. You are holding a ghost, and yet, the ghost is alive in the language, the rituals, the very rhythm of the civilization that followed. The flood that began the Xia mirrors another flood remembered across the world. The Sumerians spoke of Utnapishtim, who built a boat to survive the deluge. The Hebrews told of Noah. The Hindus told of Manu, who was warned by a fish. Even the Mayans and the Incas remembered waters that swallowed the earth. Different names, different lands, one memory, a time when the world began again. Was it coincidence that so many myths recall the same event? Or did humanity once share a single story, scattered by distance but bound by memory? If so, the Xia was not just China's beginning. It was part of a global echo, the memory of a world reborn from water. In recent years, scientists discovered layers of flood sediment near Jishi Gorge on the Yellow River, evidence of a catastrophic event around 1920 BCE. They found human remains, settlements washed away, and traces of a dam that had burst. The radiocarbon dates aligned perfectly with the legends of Yu. The myth, it seems, carried truth in its bones. But science can measure only what is left behind. It cannot measure faith or the power of a story to shape destiny. Because whether the Xia ruled 1,000 miles of river or never ruled at all, its influence is written in every dynasty that followed. For the Shang, it was the cautionary tale of failure. For the Zhou, the moral foundation of rule. For the Han, the symbol of continuity. For modern China, it is a reminder that civilization begins not with conquest, but with the courage to restore balance. Yu's flood may have ended 4,000 years ago, but humanity still faces its own deluges of greed, ignorance, and arrogance. And perhaps the story of the Xia survives to remind us that every flood can be tamed if we are willing to build the channels together. Imagine standing on the banks of the Yellow River at dusk. The air is heavy with mist. The sun sets in a haze of gold and crimson. Beneath the water lies the silt of millennia, and somewhere below that, perhaps, the stones of a vanished city, a temple buried, a throne dissolved, a civilization forgotten yet still alive in story. The waves murmur the same sound they made 4,000 years ago. The river flows, as it always has, carrying the whispers of kings who may have never lived, and of people who believe they did. This is the power of myth, not to deceive, but to endure. In the end, the Xia may remain forever unproven. But in every sense that matters, it exists. It exists in the idea that history is a mirror, reflecting the soul of a nation. It exists in the rhythm of dynasties rising and falling, each claiming the same divine approval that Yu first received. It exists in the heart of every story that begins with chaos and ends in order. The Xia Dynasty, China's shadow, its first empire, its first myth, its first dream. Between heaven and earth, between truth and legend, it stands unseen but unforgotten. And as long as the Yellow River flows, its shadow will flow with it.